Okay, so this video is a real quick unboxing and intro to the Baofeng UV5R radio. You're going to see a lot of other videos about these things online right now because it's pretty much the number one 2 meter, 4 meter, dual band capable, handheld, semi-disposable radio on the market. This one, interestingly enough, came to me as a sales sample from one of the Chinese companies, and it came from a European warehouse, so it came packaged slightly differently from what you might see in the US, but what you're going to see in the US on these quite often comes from the Chinese warehouses. And so I'll show you what the main difference is on that. It's not much of a difference, and sometimes when you open up a box, you'll get what you get. Pricing on these is all over the map depending on how many you buy. Now, internally in China, these things are about $21 each. But that's if you're buying like 100 or 200 or a container full of them. You can buy these for around $50 each if you shop online and are a little bit careful about shopping them. I'm going to have a couple of links in the description here. Those are places that currently have the relatively recent models in stock, if not the most recent models. There's also an increasing market of upgrade parts and accessories, larger batteries, other really good upgrade stuff coming out for these. They are not going away anytime soon, and I think these are going to end up becoming really the world standard in small, portable 2 meter, 4 meter two-way radios. So it's better to learn them now than later. The other thing we need to look into on the cost of these, where they have a foreign source mail order price of, let's say, $45 to $55, when you see these at retail in local shops in the United States, you're going to see them anywhere from $75 to $120. There's a lot of reasons for that, and probably the number one reason you're going to see the upper end of that price range is because that shop offers some level of service, assistance with programming, and perhaps may even be selling pre-programmed radios. So a lot of the value that you'll see in a Baofeng UV5R radio is actually going outside of the Chinese market, and that has to do with the service involved with delivery, transport, servicing, and programming. And programming, I have to keep stressing, is a really big deal. So don't be surprised if a pre-programmed set-up radio has a street price of $75 to $125. And so we're going to get into how this thing gets initially set up, and I'm going to go over a couple of the basic features and contents of the package. And so here we have the stuff unpacked. It basically comes in two trays inside the box. We've got the two trays here. We unpack them. One of the things you got to look out for is sometimes there's a little bit of stuff that's underneath another item in a tray. So when we look at this, you take a little bit of inventory. What I've found is there's a little bit of a variable in sometimes with what's in the box. Now, the radios, from what I can tell, run on a little bit bigger than USB power, so you can't set up a USB charger with these. There are USB cables for these, but they're used for programming and computer interface. What you've got is a battery here. It's a 7.4 volt battery, but obviously that varies a little bit depending on the charge. But it is a lithium-ion battery, and according to this, 1800 milliamp hours. A little bit beefier than what you're going to see in a modern cell phone, but similar to what you'd see in some of the, let's say, early 2000s cell phones. And the battery alone, I would say, is easily, I mean, that's probably about $10 worth of the value of the radio. And when we look at the wholesale side, when the Chinese put something into the production on this, the battery's a big chunk of the game. And they do have higher capacity batteries. Basically, they're longer. They stretch down a little further. Other than that, they all plug in exactly the same way. When you buy one of these on a more deluxe kit, you may or may not get this battery in addition to the larger battery when you do that. So then we have a charging base. You'll see this with a lot of Motorola type radios and stuff like that. This works about the same way. Basically a series of metal contacts. We've got the plug-in right here which corresponds to whether you're using the AC adapter or a DC adapter. And that allows the radio to sit, upright. So they give you a charging base out of the box. Now, when you're talking like Kenwood, Yaesu, some of those companies, that charging base is separate. But remember, with this thing, they're giving it to you out of the box. The other thing, of course, they give you a little charging indicator. Basically, if it's red, you have not fully reached your power. If it's green, you have. The other thing is, it seems to smooth and regulate the power a little bit more than you'll get when you directly, let's say if you run a direct charge on a radio. But I think with this one, we don't plug directly into the radio. You've got to keep that charging base around then. So then you'll get a little clip here. The clip doesn't block or interfere with the battery installation. And what it is you've got a couple of holes right here. You've got screws that are going to come already on the radio. If these screws get lost, replacement's a little tricky, but not impossible. If you can look a little carefully here, you're going to see that these are Phillips head, okay? And basically it's a PH1. If you have a Leatherman tool with a little screwdriver thing, that's actually halfway between a PH1 and a PH2, so it should work fine on these. Now, you're going to see some little hex drive screws on there too. You notice those little metal hex drive screws. On the radio head unit, the main unit for this, you're going to have a lot of people that tell you that it's a disposal unit. There's nothing they can do to work on, fix, or modify it. Well, in reality, that's not fully true. What it is these are so cheap, they'd rather just replace the whole unit than do any kind of servicing on it. In the long term, let's say you're cut off from a resupply, you may be able to fix these things, or at least cannibalize parts between them. Let's say one gets submerged, or one gets smashed, or something like that happens. But basically, these 4 screws are what you can use to get this thing apart, and you may be able to cannibalize parts between different versions. I think that's just our battery release. You can see a little spring-loaded lever. There's actually nothing on these that I would consider half-stepping cheap. Getting back to our inventory, I'm going to go over this again last. So we've got a little belt clip. Again, you're going to need a screwdriver to install that. A lot of people don't install it at all if they're going to just be carrying this inside of a pouch. You've got your AC adapter, which interestingly enough is a 8 volt. It's something like 8.5 or 8.4 volts to charge the radio. This thing puts out 10 volts. So if you're going to try and do this thing with the 12 volt stuff, and the 12 volt stuff is actually running at 14, you're going to have problems. So this AC adapter is also made to work on European AC. It will run on 240 European AC. Oddly enough, and this being a Euro market unit, this came with this little adapter, which I don't fully understand, because it's got the American style plugs here, and it plugs in here, and it just turned an American style plug into an American style plug. Now that could be why, for whatever reason, they got this to me from the European warehouse instead of the Chinese warehouses. They realized that they had shipped a batch to Europe with this adapter. So over in Europe, I think what you're going to get is you're going to get the 2 European pin style, and then you're going to get this if you want to use this, let's say on U.S. military bases. There is a lot of stuff which still uses U.S. plugs. And so if you're getting this within proximity of a U.S. military base, with a PX, that sort of a thing, you're going to see inside American buildings in Europe, you're still sometimes going to see the American style plug-ins. And that varies a lot, so it helps to use the adapter stuff. My recommendation when you're going to buy accessories for these is you definitely have the car charger plugs around. The car charger replaces this with 12 volt stuff, and you're going to plug into that. They'll give you a neat little strap here. It's always nice to have the extra stuff. They're going to give you their antenna, a little 2 meter, 4 meter optimized antenna. It's a little screw-in setup, pretty high quality, especially when you consider the price on this. But what you're going to see on the U.S. ham market is a bunch of guys playing around with hot rod antennas that will optimize your transmit capability for the most part, but sometimes they'll set them up to optimize your receive capability too. Depends a lot on what's going on. But you'll see a lot of optimized accessory antennas where if they're made by some hobby shop guy in the United States, they may end up costing you as much as the regular radio. Another thing they're going to give you is usually they're going to give you some sort of a little speaker mic setup. They vary a little bit. Now this one is a two-prong. Okay, you see how that's a two-prong? Basically Motorola two-prong. So you can use other Motorola style two-prong accessories. A lot of the Radio Shack stuff will do that too. This particular one has a lapel microphone and of course a little earpiece on that. Getting back to the radio head unit, and that's going to be a series of videos in and of itself. There are variances a little bit on these radios, and they're going to externally look about the same, except there's a couple with different colors: yellow, orange, camouflage green, and then a camouflage like with a woodland style camo pattern. If you look on the back is where you're going to start to figure out what series radio you have. Now this particular one is what is sold on some of the websites as a slightly more deluxe model. Pretty much all of them are going to be at the 136 to 174 megahertz 2 meter. And remember that if you're transmitting legally on the ham band 2 meter that's licensed for like civil ham band stuff, it's much narrower than that. So this radio is going to be capable of transmit on some channels that you need to stay off of. There's some legal restrictions on that. On the 4 meter band, and that's basically what this is, those are usually, there is a narrow range inside of this where if you get a regular ham license, you can transmit and receive in that narrow range. There's also a lot of business band stuff, and this is where a lot of your primary buyers for these things are going to want to be able to function, because you're working with a company or a municipality and you want to have your own radio rather than be issued a radio and depend on them. So you want to have a broad range, because you never quite know who you're working with, how you're going to need to have that radio programmed. If you're going to run a small radio shop and you're going to be selling to the local market, tow truck operators, cab dispatch, anybody who still uses radios instead of cell phones or to supplement their cell phone, their licenses are probably going to be somewhere in the 4 meter range, and you can make your own adult decisions on whether or not you want to pay the extra few bucks every once in a while to get the radio that goes up to the 520, or whether it goes, a lot of them will max out in the 470 range. The owner's manual, last and probably one of the least useful items in this. The reality is there's some people starting to publish books on the UV5R radio, because just like they did with the Yaesu radios and the ICOMs and all of that, the owner's manual really doesn't have all your answers. It's one reason there's a lot of videos on YouTube about this and that sort of a thing. The books are also relatively standardized and may not 100% correspond to the particular radio you have. For example, in this book, what I've had, and I'll try to get back to that page here while I'm still on the camera, is the description on the setup was for the, let's find it. Okay, so let's see here. We had the frequency range right here. On the frequency range here that it talks about in the owner's manual, I believe it was talking about our 4 meter limitation is in here somewhere. Yeah, here goes up to 480 on a TRX RX. So the 136 to 174 pretty common, okay. But the question is, some of these radios, and you got to look on the back of it. The 136 to 174, and then the 500 to 400 to 520 here, where this one is 400 to 480. So there's that other 40 megahertz. If you're not actually going to use it, it doesn't matter. And a lot of times, if you're going to buy these things, this is all they're going to guarantee that it goes up to. But every once in a while, you get lucky, you pop the box open, and they gave you one that goes to 520. If a retailer knows for certain that they have one that goes up to 520, it is worth a little bit more money, but it's kind of a luck of the draw situation. The other thing is, on the Chinese side, they will advertise a different price on the ones that go up to 520, and at that point you would have a right to expect the one that actually goes up to that. We're going to go into assembly and setup in the next video. Okay, so assembly on this thing is going to be relatively simple. We've unpacked everything. The radio itself, the head unit, we want to attach the antenna before we attach the battery, just on the chance that if you hit the transmit button or something transmits while there's no antenna attached, it can pop some stuff in there. So we attach the antenna first. It just kind of goes snug. There's no click in. The battery has a sliding rail type system, so we slide it from the bottom and it snaps in place. I mean, you'll see how that moved. If you need to remove it, we push this down and we can pull the battery back out. So this thing will be ready to start charging. It may be ready to power up at this point. The charging base, dirt simple. We've got a plug. You'll see this type of plug with a lot of other stuff that is 12 volt. And again, I need to strongly warn you, this is not 12 volt. This is actually 10 volt output on this little wall wart. This thing's an 8 volt output, so you can't just plug a straight 12 volt into this. It has to be translated down to 10 volts. So this is all built to go, and that's what happens. That's dirt simple. So this thing will be able to slide in here. There's a little slot mechanism that will keep that. So it looks loose, but that's fine. It works like that. The other thing that it will do, if we separate this out, is if you do purchase spare batteries, you have to make sure that you engage the slots, but you can charge batteries separate from the radio. Let's say if you need to keep your radio up and running, you have extra batteries, you can do that. So we're going to plug that in there. If you want to use any kind of a speaker mic, voice mic type thing, this is what we call a 2-pin thing. It's pretty clearly SP and a mic, so these are different sizes, so it's pretty hard to flip these around. It's just sometimes what people will do is, let's say you want to use your computer speakers or a boombox speaker or in a separate microphone plug. You could plug two separate items into this, and they're different sizes, so you don't plug the wrong one into the right thing. So we got the speaker and the microphone thing. It's obviously pretty water resistant when it's closed. When it's opened, it's a little bit, kind of depends on whether it's rubberized or not. So at that point, we're assembled, except for, of course, putting this on. Very, very, very simple setup here. We're going to use a common Leatherman tool. And I want to show something else, and the quality on this unit that is I consider impressive. If you got something that's really cheap and cheesy, these screws are going to be kind of like a little wood screw that just screws into the plastic. And on these, there's actual metal. It's a fine thread screw, and it goes into metal. And we don't need to be on camera for installing this whole thing off. Without the second-by-second replay on that, we got that bolted back up. So that's our radio. That's with all the stuff installed. It's still going to work with a charger. You'll notice that that belt clip doesn't really come down on that to block it. The thing is, if you wear the radio on your belt and you're only holding it up by this, yes, it's a high-quality belt clip, but it really ought to go inside of a pouch. That's my opinion. And so these are okay. The other thing is you could clip it, let's say, to the outside of some gear or sun visor on a vehicle or something like that. That's fine. Now, usually there's a little bit of residual power in these radios when we first get them. So we're going to power it up. We'll go over a couple of the features on it. So everything put together, plugged in, ready to go. Now with the little speaker setup on here, little microphone setup, the radio is not going to work through the speaker. It'll work through all of this, and then you've got a little push to talk here. But again, not all the radios are going to have this as an accessory. Usually it's deluxe models, and this is a very inexpensive item. You'll see a lot of substitutes sold online because those are accessories. Other factory accessories, of course, are going to be the car charger or a larger speaker mic and other stuff. So with this unit in its charging cradle, which you could actually run a 12-volt system to, you just need to have it translated down to 10 volts coming into this. We can turn the radio on and we can use it in that setting. There's other adapters and other guys online that play around with these things, that they can actually use this as a base station by just having an antenna plug roll into it. But you also have to realize that the electronics on this, they're not really, there's no cooling system, there's no cooling fans, anything like that. So if it's being used all day, every day, let's say you have power boosters coming through this or going out of it, you may wear these out. I mean, it's entirely possible. So if your communication system is going to depend on these, I suggest having some spares around. And not only is it the spare radio just to swap out the whole thing, but it gives you the opportunity of having something to cannibalize for parts just in case something becomes damaged. These are made in China, so obviously your spare parts are going to be coming from far away. And you may find your local radio dealer guy he does have spare parts available because he's cannibalizing them for parts. And that's entirely normal and appropriate when you've got something like this. Obviously, a lot of stuff comes in a kit. So hopefully we've gotten into this. There are a lot of buttons and a lot of functions and a lot of stuff to do with these radios. It's a very complex piece of equipment that you really want to have a specialist in your group master, and then everybody else get relatively familiar with. I am not my group expert with these things, I'll tell you right now, and I am going to try and get that guy to come over and help out, and we're going to go over more details on these. But as you kind of get your little groups together and everything like that, you're probably going to end up doing business with somebody who's a specialist in getting all of these things together. And understand that, there's business ethics involved with that. There's some legal issues with radio licensing. Although there is no legal restriction on owning it, there is no legal restriction on having it pre-programmed to work with whatever channels you choose to work with. I would urge you, however, do not interfere with any other lawful communications on these. Don't screw around with the hospital people. Don't screw around with the cops. You can actually go to prison for interfering with emergency services transmissions on these. So if you are going to have these programmed to emergency services channels, which I choose not to even have any of the program radios, none of my radios are going to be pre-programmed to emergency services channels. Some people I work with do things with the American Red Cross and disaster relief. We have the authority to transmit on those channels, and they actually do not mesh directly with emergency services. Somebody has to relay those messages. We don't talk directly to their dispatch on the emergency services. Our own dispatch talks to theirs, and then we rarely will communicate directly. And that is an issue because it's not a cell phone system. Everybody hears a conversation on a particular channel. There's a lot more to be said on these. There's several other people with very informative videos online. I suggest you look at them. I suggest you get in touch with somebody, preferably locally, who knows these radios relatively well, and learn them, because these are going to be they pretty much are a world standard for 2-meter, 4-meter radio. Again, there's some links in my description here on where you can buy these. I'm not going to guarantee it's the absolute lowest price, but it is a trustworthy seller. They are a regular business, and it's very competitive.